Caleb Johnson thought prison had taken everything from him. After serving time for a violent mistake years ago, he returned to a coal town in West Virginia, determined to live quietly and work honestly. But in a place ruled by greed and old prejudice, his past made him the perfect scapegoat. When a massive coal theft was exposed, manipulated records pointed straight at him. Alone in court, judged before he could speak, Caleb seemed ready to accept guilt he didn't deserve, until the truth surfaced. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The town of Red Hollow, West Virginia, woke slowly beneath a low gray sky. Early spring rain clung to the mountains, turning the narrow roads slick and dark. Coal dust still lingered in the air, settling on porches, fences, and the backs of old pickup trucks like a memory no one could quite wash away. The mine siren echoed through the valley at dawn, the same sound it had made for decades, calling men underground and reminding the town who it belonged to. Caleb Johnson stepped off the bus with one small duffel bag and nowhere to look but forward. He was 31 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, built from years of hard labor even before prison hardened him further. His skin was deep brown, his face angular with a quiet severity that came not from anger but from restraint. Short black hair was trimmed close to his scalp, not out of style but habit. Prison had taught him efficiency. His eyes, dark and watchful, held the kind of calm that came from learning when not to speak. Caleb had learned that silence could be safer than honesty. 3 years earlier, this same town had watched him leave in the back of a police car. A fight at the mine, one punch too many, one moment of temper after weeks of insults and pressure. The man he hit was white. The injuries were serious. The charges came fast. No one waited to hear the whole story. Prison took his freedom, but it did not take his resolve. Now he was back. The mine office stood at the edge of town, a squat concrete building streaked with rust. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The smell of stale coffee and damp paperwork filled the air. Behind the counter sat Frank Dalton, the site manager. Frank Dalton was in his mid-50s, thick around the waist with thinning sandy hair combed carefully to hide the bald spot he pretended didn't exist. His pale eyes were sharp, calculating, and rarely warm. Years of authority had taught him how to smile without meaning it and how to judge men before they spoke. He looked at Caleb the way one looks at a problem already solved. "So," Frank said, flipping through a folder without inviting Caleb to sit. "You've worked mines before." "Yes, sir." Frank glanced at the file again. His mouth tightened, almost imperceptibly. "And you've been away." "Yes, sir." The silence stretched. Frank closed the folder. "We're short on hands. Pays low, works hard. No complaints, no trouble, you understand?" Caleb nodded. "I understand." That was how he got the job? No second chances were mentioned. No trust was offered. Only the understanding that he was replaceable. By noon, Caleb was underground. The mine was a world of darkness and sound. Metal groaning, drills screaming, boots scraping against stone. The air was heavy, pressing against the lungs. Caleb worked with steady efficiency, his movements precise, his focus absolute. He took the most dangerous section without comment, hauling loads others avoided. Some men watched him. Others looked away. No one spoke his name. Among the crew was Luke Harris, a white man in his early 20s, tall and lanky with messy blonde hair that stuck out from beneath his helmet. Luke had a narrow face, pale skin dusted with coal grime, and eyes that carried curiosity rather than judgment. He was new, too, still learning the rhythm of the mine, still unsure where he fit. During a break, Luke offered Caleb a nod. "Hell of a pace you keep," he said, attempting a casual smile. "Just doing the work," Caleb replied. Luke hesitated, then sat nearby anyway. For a few minutes, they shared silence, comfortable, almost human. Later that afternoon, Luke was pulled aside by a senior worker. Voices were low, urgent. "You don't want trouble," the man warned him. "Stay clear of Johnson. Management's watching." Luke glanced back at Caleb, guilt flickering across his face. When he returned, he avoided eye contact. Caleb noticed. He always noticed. That evening, after 12 hours underground, Caleb returned to the small room he rented on the edge of town. The place was barely more than a converted storage unit. One bed, one table, a cracked window that let in cold air and the sound of distant trucks. On the table sat an old smartphone and a stack of envelopes. Caleb washed the coal dust from his hands slowly, methodically. Then he sat down and counted his pay. Most of it went into an envelope addressed in careful handwriting. Mary Johnson, his mother. Mary Johnson was in her late 50s, a thin woman with fragile bones and lungs damaged by years of factory work. She lived 2 towns away in subsidized housing, dependent on oxygen most days. She worried too much, blamed herself too often. Caleb sent money every week. He never visited, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't stand the shame in her eyes, even when she tried to hide it behind love. He dialed her number, listened to the phone ring once, twice, then ended the call before she could answer. Some conversations were harder than prison. Days passed. Caleb arrived early, left late. He spoke little, worked much. Mistakes made by others somehow drifted toward him. Tools went missing near his station. A supervisor once accused him of miscounting loads without proof. Frank Dalton watched from a distance. To Frank, Caleb wasn't a man trying to rebuild. He was a risk, a stain, something that could spread if not contained. One evening, as the rain returned and the mountains disappeared into fog, Caleb stood outside the mine watching trucks roll past. They were heavier than the manifest suggested. He noticed which ones skipped the main checkpoint, which ones slowed near the tree line. He said nothing. Yet. Back in his room, Caleb wrote down times, plate numbers, patterns, not because he planned to accuse anyone, but because prison had taught him one rule above all others. If you already look guilty, you must remember everything. As he lay on his bed, the mine siren echoed once more through the valley. Caleb stared at the ceiling, jaw tight, hands folded over his chest. He had done everything right. And still, the world kept its distance. The rain did not stop that week. It clung to Red Hollow like a warning no one wanted to hear. The mine roads turned slick, the loading yard heavy with mud and diesel fumes. Inside the tunnels, water dripped steadily from the ceiling, mixing with coal dust into a paste that coated boots and lungs alike. Caleb Johnson adjusted his helmet and stepped into the cage lift before sunrise, already aware that something had shifted. He felt it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room. The first incident seemed small. A foreman named Rick Hanley, a broad, square-faced man in his early 40s with a permanently reddened nose and thick arms from decades of lifting, called Caleb out for stacking supports incorrectly. Rick had a voice that carried even when he whispered, and a temper sharpened by too many layoffs in his past. He believed discipline kept a man employed, and suspicion kept him safe. Years earlier, after his brother lost a job during a corporate restructuring, Rick had developed a habit of aligning himself with management at all costs. "You cutting corners now?" Rick asked loudly in front of the crew. Caleb glanced at the supports. They were aligned exactly to regulation. "No, sir." Rick stepped closer, breath heavy with tobacco. "Then fix it again. Properly." Caleb did as told. That afternoon, his name appeared on a shift reassignment sheet. Graveyard rotation, Section D. Section D was known among miners as the wet throat, a narrow, unstable tunnel where collapses were rare but possible. It was the kind of place assigned to men who had something to prove, or something to lose. Luke Harris avoided eye contact when Caleb passed him. The warning had worked. The friendliness had evaporated. Luke's posture stiffened around supervisors now, his earlier curiosity replaced with caution. 2 days later, Caleb noticed a discrepancy in his pay stub. 4 hours missing. He brought it quietly to payroll. Payroll was managed by Darla Whitmore, a heavyset woman in her mid-30s with short brown hair cut bluntly at the jawline. She wore bright nail polish that chipped at the edges and spoke with the tired impatience of someone who processed numbers all day, but rarely controlled outcomes. Darla had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, but an early pregnancy had redirected her life into clerical work. "It's what the sheet says," she told Caleb without looking up. "I worked those hours." "Then talk to Rick." Rick denied it. Frank Dalton watched from the hallway, hands folded behind his back. Caleb understood the pattern. Small corrections, small humiliations. Nothing large enough to fight, just enough to remind him of his position. But Frank Dalton was not careless. Beneath his outward calm, he observed something that unsettled him. Caleb did not complain loudly, he did not argue, he did not retaliate. He adjusted, recalculated, and kept watching. That was dangerous. One evening, after a long shift, Caleb lingered near the loading dock under the pretense of checking final counts. Trucks rolled in and out beneath floodlights. The manifest clipboard rested on a metal table. He compared the extraction log from underground with the outgoing shipment record. The numbers did not breathe the same air. 15 tons mined. 12 recorded. 3 missing. Not enough to cause alarm on a single day, but consistent. A truck labeled partial load sagged visibly on its suspension. Caleb said nothing. He began memorizing patterns. Which drivers avoided conversation? Which trucks took the northern exit road rather than the paved southern one? One driver stood out. Earl Simmons, a wiry man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and sunken cheeks. Earl's posture leaned forward as if bracing against wind that wasn't there. He rarely smiled and rarely stopped moving. People said he'd been driving since before most of the crew were born. There was something nervous in the way his fingers tapped the steering wheel while waiting for clearance. Caleb noticed that Earl's departure times often didn't match the paperwork. Inside the administration office, Martha Green watched Caleb through the glass partition. Martha was 62, tall and narrow-shouldered, her silver hair always tied into a tight bun at the base of her neck. Deep lines framed her mouth, not from anger, but from restraint. She had worked at the mine for 28 years, starting as a secretary before rising to bookkeeping. Her husband had died of black lung disease when she was 45, leaving her with 2 sons and a mortgage she could not afford to lose. Martha understood numbers intimately. They whispered to her when something was wrong, and lately they had been whispering loudly. She saw Caleb compare sheets one afternoon. She saw the pause in his expression. She saw recognition forming. Their eyes met briefly. Martha looked away first. Fear was a practical thing. It paid bills. It kept grandchildren in school clothes. She had learned to survive by not asking questions she already knew the answers to. Later that week, Frank Dalton summoned Caleb to his office again. Frank's tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled to reveal forearms thick with hair. He leaned back in his chair, examining Caleb with that same half-smile. "Heard you've been double-checking counts," Frank said lightly. "Just making sure I'm accurate." "Accuracy's good?" Frank's eyes sharpened. "But curiosity can be distracting. Focus on your assignment." "Yes, sir." Frank leaned forward slightly. "You understand, Johnson. We value stability here. Men who fit in." Caleb held his gaze calmly. "I'm here to work." Frank nodded once, dismissing him. After that conversation, the assignments grew harsher. Caleb was paired with the least experienced workers in unstable areas, expected to compensate for their mistakes. Equipment meant for his section went missing twice. A drill malfunctioned mid-shift, forcing him to finish manually. Whispers followed him underground. Management's watching him. He's trying too hard. He thinks he's smarter. The irony did not escape Caleb. He was being punished not for failure, but for diligence. One night, during a heavy storm, power flickered in Section D. Water pooled around their boots. Luke slipped near a loose support beam, and Caleb grabbed him before he fell. "Thanks," Luke muttered, shaken. Caleb simply nodded. Later, Luke approached him quietly near the lockers. "They're saying you're making waves," Luke said, voice low. "I'm doing my job." Luke hesitated. "Sometimes that's enough." It was the closest thing to solidarity Caleb had heard in weeks. In the following days, Caleb began documenting inconsistencies privately. He wrote times in a small notebook he kept inside his jacket. He tracked which manifests bore Martha's signature and which bore Frank's override initials. He never confronted anyone. But Frank Dalton had noticed something else. Other men cut corners. They could be persuaded. Caleb could not, and that made him unpredictable. Martha Green stayed late one evening to reconcile shipment entries. Rain streaked across her office window. She compared outgoing totals to extraction logs and felt her chest tighten. The numbers balanced only after adjustments she had not personally entered. She looked toward the yard and saw Caleb standing alone under the floodlight, staring at a departing truck. For a fleeting moment, she considered calling him inside. Instead, she turned off her desk lamp. The mine siren echoed again across Red Hollow. The sound carried differently now. Not just a call to work, but a warning disguised as routine. Caleb walked back to his rented room through damp streets, boots heavy with mud. He placed the notebook beside his bed and lay down fully dressed, eyes open. He understood the message. He was no longer invisible. He was becoming inconvenient. And in Red Hollow, inconvenient men rarely lasted long. The rain finally stopped, but the air over Red Hollow felt heavier than before, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Morning fog hung low across the loading yard, softening the outlines of trucks and machinery into pale shadows. Caleb Johnson arrived early again, boots still damp from the night before, unaware that this would be the day the ground beneath him shifted. Rick Hanley approached him first, wiping grease from his hands with a rag already blackened beyond saving. His square jaw was tight, but his tone carried something new. Measured neutrality. "Dalton wants to see you. Office." Caleb nodded once and walked toward the administrative building. He noticed the way two workers paused mid-conversation to watch him pass. Curiosity had replaced suspicion in their eyes. Inside, Frank Dalton stood near the window overlooking the yard. Sunlight cut across his face, highlighting the faint web of lines at the corners of his pale eyes. He looked almost cordial. "Johnson," Frank said, gesturing toward a chair. This time he invited him to sit. Caleb did. Frank folded his hands on the desk. "You've been thorough, consistent. I respect that." Caleb remained still. "We're restructuring some responsibilities," Frank continued. "Inventory verification and outbound shipment oversight. I need someone precise." A beat of silence. "I'm offering you the position." The words did not land cleanly. Caleb blinked once, absorbing them carefully. A promotion. For a man with a record. In this town. "Why me?" Caleb asked quietly. Frank's smile was faint. "Because you notice things." It sounded like praise. It felt like measurement. The position meant moving from extraction to the loading dock, supervising manifests, verifying tonnage, signing off on outbound shipments. A higher wage. A cleaner uniform. A desk inside the yard office. Caleb thought of his mother's oxygen machine humming in a small apartment 2 towns away. "I'll take it," he said. Frank nodded as if the decision had already been made. Later that day, Caleb was introduced to the small inventory office beside the loading dock. The room smelled of paper, diesel fumes, and old coffee. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A computer monitor blinked on a metal desk scarred by years of use. Waiting inside was Martha Green. Martha stood when Caleb entered, smoothing the front of her cardigan. Up close, the strain in her posture was more visible. Fine veins traced the backs of her hands. Her gray eyes, sharp and intelligent, carried fatigue that had settled deep. "I'll walk you through the process," she said gently. Her voice was steady, but something trembled beneath it. Martha showed him the digital logging system, the printed manifests, the authorization stamps. She explained the timing of truck departures, the weight confirmations, the dual signature requirement for outbound loads. As she spoke, Caleb watched her hands. They moved with familiarity, but occasionally hesitated over certain folders. "These," she said, sliding a stack of binders toward him, "are the adjusted records from the past quarter." "Adjusted?" Caleb asked. "Reconciled," she corrected softly. He opened one binder. The numbers were clean. Too clean. Uniform corrections in identical ink. Margins aligned as if smoothed by design. Frank entered briefly, standing in the doorway. "Johnson, these books are solid. I need you to keep them that way." Caleb met his gaze. "Yes, sir." When Frank left, Martha exhaled slowly. "You'll sign here," she said, pointing to the lower right corner of a form. "Verification acknowledgement." Caleb paused before signing. He read every line. Martha watched him, her lips pressed thin. That evening, word of the promotion spread across the yard. Luke Harris approached him near the lockers, helmet tucked under his arm. Luke's expression was conflicted. Impressed, uncertain. "They moved you fast," Luke said. "Yeah." "You think it's a good thing?" Caleb considered the question. "It's work." Rick Hanley passed behind them and gave Luke a sharp look. Luke straightened immediately. By nightfall, Caleb sat alone in the inventory office reviewing the latest outbound schedule. Trucks rolled out under floodlights, engines rumbling against the quiet hills. He compared extraction totals from underground with shipping confirmations. Again, the numbers did not match perfectly, but now the discrepancies were smaller, hidden inside rounding margins. Earl Simmons's truck appeared on the list again. Partial load. Route clearance approved. Through the window, Caleb watched Earl light a cigarette before climbing into his cab. The older driver's movements were restless, his shoulders tense even in stillness. Two mechanics lingered near the garage entrance, Tommy Reyes and Derek Cole. Tommy was short and muscular, with dark hair cropped tight against his head and a habit of chewing gum aggressively. Derek, taller and lean, wore a perpetual smirk that never reached his eyes. Both kept their voices low when speaking, laughter clipped short whenever Caleb stepped closer. Fragments of conversation drifted through the open yard. North Trail's clear tonight. Rain washed the tracks clean. Caleb stored the words without reacting. Later, alone in his rented room, he placed his small notebook beside the bed again. But this time, he added something new. He set his phone on the table and adjusted the camera settings. He downloaded a recording application. He tested the microphone by speaking softly. "Inventory log. Tuesday, 10:42 p.m." The playback was clear. He wasn't accusing anyone. He wasn't planning exposure. He was protecting himself. The following nights confirmed his unease. One shipment departed with a manifest listing 12 tons. The scale display flickered briefly before settling. Caleb replayed the recorded numbers in his mind. The weight had read closer to 14 before correction. He began discreetly filming scale readings with his phone held low against his thigh. Short clips, no confrontation. One evening, as fog rolled back into the valley, Caleb stepped outside the office for air. He heard Tommy Reyes speaking behind the maintenance shed. "Trail's dry past the bend," Tommy muttered. "No cameras back there." Derek replied, "Keep it tight. Dalton doesn't want noise." Caleb moved silently away before they noticed him. Inside, Martha Green pretended not to see the tension gathering in his posture. "Everything aligning?" she asked quietly. So far, Caleb answered. She studied him for a moment, then looked down at her ledger. The overhead light cast long shadows across her desk. Martha had spent years convincing herself that compliance was survival, but watching Caleb sign each verification form stirred something uncomfortable inside her. She remembered her husband coughing black into a sink, management promising reforms that never came. "You don't have to stay late every night," she said gently. "I don't mind," Caleb replied. That was true. The office felt safer than the tunnels. But safety was an illusion. Frank Dalton began appearing more frequently at odd hours. He would step inside the inventory room, glance at the screens, ask casual questions. "Settling in?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Keep the flow smooth." Flow. It was a curious word. One afternoon, Caleb found a fresh stack of binders on his desk, records he had not requested. Each page bore neat corrections in identical handwriting. Some adjustments predated his promotion. Frank leaned against the door frame. "Cleaned up some historical errors," Frank said. "You'll certify continuity." Caleb flipped through the pages slowly. The adjustments were too symmetrical, patterns forced into order. "You want me to sign off?" he asked. Frank's pale eyes hardened slightly. "That's the job." Caleb nodded. That night, alone again, he recorded his voice in a steady whisper. Received revised ledgers. Pre-existing corrections. Noted. He locked the files behind a password and uploaded copies to a secure cloud account under a name no one in Red Hollow would guess. The fog thickened outside his window. A train horn echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the hills. Caleb lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. A promotion should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt like a spotlight. He understood now that the position was not trust. It was placement. And placement meant proximity. He did not yet know the full shape of what was forming. But he knew this much. He had been moved closer to the center of something. And whatever it was already in motion. The morning the audit came, the sky above Red Hollow was a sharp, unnatural blue, the kind that appears after days of rain, as if the world has washed itself clean just before something dirty surfaces. Caleb Johnson unlocked the inventory office before dawn, unaware that by nightfall his name would be dragged across every local broadcast in the state. The first sign was not dramatic. It was procedural. 2 unfamiliar vehicles rolled into the yard just after 8 a.m., dark sedans with state plates. Out stepped 3 men in pressed jackets and polished shoes that had never known coal dust. One of them introduced himself as Mr. Harold Pierce, a compliance auditor from the Regional Mining Authority. Pierce was tall, thin, with silver hair parted neatly and rimless glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. His voice carried polite authority, the kind sharpened by years of exposing irregularities in quiet boardrooms. "Routine reconciliation," Pierce said calmly. "Randomized shipment review." Frank Dalton's smile was controlled. "Of course." Caleb stood behind the desk as requested, providing files, opening ledgers, pulling manifests. He felt it immediately. The discrepancies that had once been subtle were now glaring. Entire entries misaligned. Shipment codes that didn't correspond to route logs. Scale readings that conflicted with printed totals. Harold Pierce flipped through a binder, brow furrowing. "These signatures," he said, tapping the bottom of a page, "are yours." Caleb looked down. Yes, every final verification bore his name. His stomach tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, sir." Rick Hanley stepped closer, arms folded. Luke Harris stood near the back wall, silent. Frank Dalton's tone shifted subtly. "Johnson oversees outbound verification." The room seemed to shrink. More binders surfaced, more inconsistencies. Not small rounding errors this time, large gaps. Dozens of tons unaccounted for across multiple weeks. Patterns too consistent to dismiss as oversight. Harold Pierce closed a ledger slowly. "We're looking at significant loss." The word hung in the air. Loss. Caleb's mind raced backward through memory. Every night shift, every corrected sheet, every adjusted ledger placed in front of him after the fact. He understood now. The corrections had not been concealment. They had been preparation. By mid-afternoon, the yard was no longer operating normally. Workers whispered in clusters. Trucks idled uncertainly. State officials moved in and out of offices. Frank Dalton's demeanor hardened. "This is unacceptable," Frank said sharply in the inventory room. "We place trust in you." Caleb looked at him carefully. "The records were provided to me." Frank's jaw tightened. "And you signed them." That part was true. At 4:12 p.m., 2 sheriff deputies entered the yard. The first was Deputy Carl Brenner, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a square chin and clipped brown hair. His uniform fit tightly over a muscular frame, posture rigid. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The second was Deputy Marcus Hill, slightly younger, leaner, with dark hair and a thoughtful gaze that lingered longer than necessary on situations before acting. His expression suggested caution rather than certainty. "Caleb Johnson?" Brenner asked. Caleb stepped forward. "You're under arrest pending investigation for financial misconduct and theft of company property." Murmurs rippled across the yard. Luke looked down at the ground. Rick Hanley shook his head slowly, disappointment arranged carefully across his features. As the deputies secured Caleb's wrists, Frank Dalton watched without blinking. The steel cuffs were cold. No one stepped forward. Not Martha Green, who stood frozen inside the office doorway, pale as paper. Not Luke. Not anyone. The ride through town was silent except for radio static. As the cruiser passed the diner on Main Street, Caleb saw 2 people staring from the window, already whispering. By evening, local news stations had the headline, "Former convict at center of multi-ton coal theft scheme." They used an old booking photo from years ago. Harsh lighting, unshaven face, younger eyes hardened by fear. They did not show the man he had become. Inside a small apartment 2 towns away, Mary Johnson sat in a worn recliner, oxygen tube looped gently beneath her nose. The television flickered in front of her. Mary was frail now, skin thin and almost translucent, cheekbones sharp beneath tired eyes. Her once strong hands trembled slightly even at rest. Years of factory labor had carved lines deep into her face, but her gaze remained kind, almost stubbornly so. When Caleb's image appeared on screen, she leaned forward. "No," she whispered. The oxygen machine hummed beside her. Her neighbor, Mrs. Helen Porter, a plump woman in her 70s with soft gray curls and a perpetual scent of lavender soap, hurried over from across the hall after hearing the television volume spike. "Mary," Helen called gently, knocking once before stepping inside. Mary's hand clutched her chest. The stress came fast. By the time paramedics arrived, Mary was struggling to breathe, the oxygen line twisted at her side. Caleb did not know this. At the holding facility, he sat on a metal bench beneath fluorescent lights. His hands were steady, though his pulse was not. Deputy Marcus Hill lingered briefly outside the cell before speaking quietly through the bars. "Anything you want to say?" Caleb met his eyes. "You've already decided." Marcus did not respond immediately. Something unreadable flickered across his expression. Then he stepped away. Back in Red Hollow, phone calls were being made. Luke Harris stared at his contact list for a long moment before deleting Caleb's number. Rick Hanley told anyone who asked that he always had doubts. Tommy Reyes and Derek Cole avoided the yard entirely. Martha Green sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at a copy of the ledger she had kept unintentionally. An extra sheet printed weeks ago and forgotten in her purse. Her thin fingers trembled. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't him." but fear remained heavier than truth. Miles away, in a modest apartment in Charleston, Evan Miller paused mid-bite of takeout when the television above the bar counter caught his attention. Evan was 27, lean and sharp-featured, with dark brown hair kept slightly too long for courtroom tradition. His suits were inexpensive but pressed carefully. His eyes held an intensity shaped by growing up watching his father lose jobs due to corporate downsizing. Injustice irritated him like sand beneath the eyelid. The headline made him freeze. Caleb Johnson. He stood slowly. Years ago, before prison, Caleb had been the quiet center of their high school football team. Disciplined, steady, the one who diffused fights rather than started them. Evan remembered that, clearly. He watched the segment carefully. The framing. The language. Repeat offender. Pattern of behavior. Evan's jaw tightened. "They're burying him," he muttered. He pulled out his phone and searched for official statements. The narrative was already formed. Signed documents, oversight failure, trusted employee abused position. Too neat. Back at the holding facility, Caleb lay back against cold concrete, staring at the ceiling. He replayed everything in his mind. Every corrected ledger, every late-night adjustment, every truck slipping into fog. He understood now with brutal clarity. The promotion had been positioning. The signatures had been anchors. The audit had not been random. It had been timed. Outside, night settled over Red Hollow once more. The mine siren remained silent for the first time in months. Operations suspended pending investigation. In town, conversations moved quickly. Guess some men don't change. Should have known. Can't fix what's broken. The story had already been decided for him. And Caleb Johnson once again sat alone behind bars while the world confirmed what it had always believed. The courthouse in Red Hollow stood on a slight rise above Main Street, its brick facade faded by decades of coal dust and winter wind. That morning, the sky was overcast again, heavy clouds pressing low over the town as if even the weather refused to look directly at what was about to unfold. Reporters gathered near the steps, camera lenses glinting under gray light. Caleb Johnson stepped out of the sheriff's vehicle in handcuffs, shoulders straight, jaw set, eyes calm but distant. There was no anger in his posture, only the stillness of someone who had learned that reacting too loudly could cost everything. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than it appeared from the outside. Wooden benches lined the floor, worn smooth by generations of waiting. The American flag stood stiffly near the judge's bench, its colors slightly dulled by age. Caleb was led to the defense table, alone. No lawyer sat beside him. He had declined a public defender. At least, that was what the paperwork said. Judge Eleanor Whitman entered precisely at 9. She was in her early 60s, tall and slender, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a severe bun. Her face was narrow, marked by fine lines earned from years of disciplined composure. Judge Whitman was known for efficiency. She disliked spectacle and valued order. Her voice carried authority without strain. Some said she had once been more sympathetic earlier in her career, before political pressure and re-election campaigns hardened her edges. She took her seat and glanced over the file. Case number 4582, The State versus Caleb Johnson. The prosecutor stood first. Assistant District Attorney Robert Hale was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with carefully styled dark hair flecked lightly with gray. His navy suit was tailored precisely, tie knotted perfectly. Hale had built his career on conviction rates and public confidence. He believed in clarity. Good men and bad men, lawful and unlawful. Complications irritated him. "Your Honor," Hale began, voice smooth and firm, "this is a case of deliberate financial misconduct involving hundreds of tons of missing coal and falsified documentation." He paced slowly before the jury box. Though this was only a preliminary hearing, spectators filled the benches. All shipment verifications bear the defendant's signature. The discrepancies occurred under his supervision. His prior criminal history demonstrates a pattern of poor judgment. The phrase lingered. Pattern. Caleb stood quietly, hands resting on the table. Judge Whitman adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Johnson, you are representing yourself at this stage?" "Yes, Your Honor." Her eyes flicked briefly to the section of the file detailing his previous conviction. She paused, almost imperceptibly, then turned the page. "Very well." Frank Dalton was called to testify. He walked to the stand with measured confidence, shoulders squared, expression solemn but controlled. He wore a charcoal suit that fit slightly too tightly at the waist. His pale eyes were carefully arranged into disappointment. "I trusted Mr. Johnson," Frank said, hands folded neatly. "Despite his history, I gave him responsibility others might not have." Caleb watched him without expression. Frank described the restructuring, the delegation of oversight, the expectation of integrity. "And you had no knowledge of these discrepancies before the audit?" Hale asked. "None," Frank replied without hesitation. Caleb felt the weight of the room shift toward certainty. Martha Green sat in the last row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a pale blue cardigan over a simple gray dress, her silver hair pinned carefully as always. From a distance, she appeared composed. Up close, her fingers trembled visibly. She avoided eye contact with anyone near her. She had not been subpoenaed. Not yet. Robert Hale placed several binders onto the evidence table. "These are the signed shipment confirmations. All properly authorized, all verified by Mr. Johnson." Judge Whitman flipped through one binder, nodding slightly. "Everything appears procedurally sound." Caleb's gaze shifted briefly to the page. The signatures were his. The corrections were invisible to anyone not looking for them. Hale continued, voice firm. "This is not a case of clerical error. This is intentional misrepresentation." The words echoed. Caleb inhaled slowly. He remembered each night under floodlights, each truck labeled partial load, each scale that flickered before settling, each time the weight display briefly showed a higher number before recalibration. He remembered Earl Simmons's restless posture behind the wheel, Tommy Reyes's low whispers near the maintenance shed, and the trucks that reported empty at the outer checkpoint. Empty. The memory replayed clearly, dispatch radio crackling with confirmation. Truck 17, empty return. But he had seen it depart loaded. Caleb spoke calmly. "Your Honor, the records were provided to me." Hale turned sharply. "And you signed them?" "Yes." "Then you accepted responsibility." Silence. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly. "Mr. Johnson, do you have documentation to challenge these records?" Caleb did not answer immediately. He had anticipated this moment. Weeks earlier, before the audit, before the arrests, before the public narrative hardened, Caleb had uploaded every recorded video, every audio note, every photographed scale reading to a secure cloud account. He had encrypted the files and sent access credentials to a single contact. Evan Miller. He had done it quietly, without announcement. Because prison had taught him something else. Never carry all your proof in your own hands. But Evan was not in the courtroom. Not yet. "I have no physical documents here," Caleb said carefully. Hale seized the opportunity. "Then we must rely on the verified record." Frank Dalton lowered his gaze solemnly, playing the part of a betrayed superior. In the back row, Martha Green's breathing grew shallow. She knew what had been adjusted. She knew the numbers had been shifted before Caleb ever touched the ledger. She also knew what speaking out might cost her. Judge Whitman closed the binder. "The court will proceed toward formal charges based on presented evidence." The phrase landed like a verdict already written. A murmur passed through the spectators. Outside the courthouse, a small group of townspeople lingered near the steps. Some shook their heads. Some folded their arms in quiet satisfaction. "I should have known," someone muttered. Back inside, Hale summarized his position succinctly. The state requests continued detention pending trial. Caleb felt the old familiarity of walls closing in, not from fear, but from recognition. The room had already chosen its narrative. Judge Whitman nodded once. Motion granted. The gavel struck softly against wood. Deputies approached. As Caleb's wrists were secured again, he turned his head slightly, just enough to see Martha Green. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Hers were filled with apology. His held no accusation, only patience. He allowed himself one final steady breath before being led out. The courtroom returned to ordinary noise. Paper shuffled, chairs scraped. Justice, at least for the moment, had followed procedure. And Caleb Johnson walked back toward a holding cell with no one beside him. The courtroom felt smaller than it had the day before. Word had spread through Red Hollow overnight, and nearly every bench was filled. The air carried a low hum of expectation, as if the town had come not to seek truth, but to witness confirmation. Caleb Johnson stood at the defense table once again, wrists free this time but posture guarded, as Judge Eleanor Whitman reviewed the final documents before formal sentencing recommendations. Outside, the sky had darkened again, clouds gathering heavy and fast. A storm threatened, wind brushing against courthouse windows with a restless impatience. Assistant District Attorney Robert Hale stood prepared, a stack of neatly organized folders resting at his side. Frank Dalton sat 2 rows behind him, expression composed, suit pressed perfectly as though the proceedings were a routine inconvenience rather than the collapse of a man's life. Judge Whitman adjusted her glasses. "This court is prepared to move forward." The words had barely left her lips when the rear doors of the courtroom opened sharply. Every head turned. A young man stepped inside, slightly out of breath but composed. He carried a worn leather briefcase tucked beneath his arm and wore a charcoal suit that fit him well but not expensively. His dark brown hair was combed back hurriedly, and his eyes, sharp, alert, determined, scanned the room quickly before settling on Caleb. Evan Miller. He moved forward with controlled urgency. "Your Honor," Evan said clearly, voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I request permission to enter an appearance on behalf of Mr. Caleb Johnson." A murmur rippled across the benches. Judge Whitman narrowed her eyes slightly. "And you are?" "Evan Miller, attorney at law, licensed in this state. I represent the defendant." Hale's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Not illegal," Evan replied calmly. Judge Whitman studied him for a moment. "Approach." Evan handed over documentation quickly. "Mr. Johnson executed representation authorization prior to these proceedings. I was awaiting secured file retrieval." Caleb watched silently. Their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. Permission was granted. Evan set his briefcase on the table and began removing a laptop, several printed documents, and a portable hard drive. "Your Honor, before sentencing is considered, the defense requests immediate review of material evidence previously unavailable." Hale crossed his arms. "We've already reviewed the books." "Exactly," Evan said quietly. He connected the laptop to the courtroom display monitor. The screen flickered, then stabilized. The first video appeared, grainy but clear enough. A scale display reading 14.2 tons, a timestamp visible in the corner. The next frame showed a printed manifest listing 12 tons, a slight shift in the room. Evan spoke calmly. "Recorded on-site by Mr. Johnson on the evening of March 14th. Scale reading captured before adjustment." He played an audio clip, voices in low conversation. "North Trail's clear tonight?" "Rain washed the tracks clean." Tommy Reyes's voice was unmistakable. Hale stepped forward sharply. "Speculative?" Evan clicked to another file. A still photograph of a dirt trail cut through the tree line north of the main exit road. Tire tracks visible despite rainfall. GPS coordinates embedded in the metadata. Unauthorized route, Evans stated. Used repeatedly on dates correlating with reported shortages. Another clip showed Earl Simmons's truck departing full. A second clip, radio chatter confirming empty return at the outer checkpoint. The courtroom quieted. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly. Evan placed printed financial statements onto the evidence table. Bank transfers tied to shell accounts. Deposits exceeding declared salary ranges. He turned toward Frank Dalton. Can Mr. Dalton explain offshore transfers made over the past 6 months? Frank's face paled almost imperceptibly. Hale interjected. Objection. Overruled, Judge Whitman said sharply. Frank cleared his throat. I don't control every financial detail. Evan pressed gently but firmly. Then who authorized these? Silence. The screen shifted to a spreadsheet overlay. Timeline alignment of scale discrepancies, unauthorized route usage, and subsequent bank deposits. Patterns became visible. The murmur returned, louder now. In the back row, Martha Green's hands shook violently. Tears welled in her eyes. She stood abruptly, the wooden bench scraping loudly against the floor. Your Honor, she said, voice breaking. I need to speak. Judge Whitman hesitated. Approach. Martha walked forward slowly, shoulders trembling. Up close, her age showed more clearly than ever. Deep lines at the corners of her eyes, exhaustion carved into her posture. I saw the adjustments, she whispered. They weren't his. The corrections were entered before he signed. I stayed quiet. I was afraid. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry. The apology hung heavier than any accusation. The courtroom shifted again. Deputy Carl Brenner moved subtly toward Frank Dalton, posture alert. Evan continued carefully. Your Honor, the defendant did sign documents, but the data was altered before reaching him. He was positioned as final verification, so the liability would rest solely with him. Judge Whitman looked directly at Frank. Mr. Dalton, do you contest these materials? Frank's composure began to fracture. Sweat beaded at his temple. These are fabricated. Evan calmly projected one final document. A signed internal memo from Frank's account authorizing route modification for efficiency purposes. Time-stamped weeks before Caleb's promotion. Frank stared at the screen. Hale stepped backward slowly. Deputy Brenner moved first. Deputy Marcus Hill followed. They approached Frank Dalton without announcement. Mr. Dalton, Brenner said evenly, you are under arrest pending investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and financial misconduct. Gasps broke across the courtroom. Tommy Reyes and Derek Cole, seated near the side wall, froze. Brenner's partner gestured for additional officers. Handcuffs clicked loudly in the silence. Frank Dalton's chair scraped harshly against wood as he was pulled upright. The system that had seemed untouchable minutes ago unraveled in plain sight. Martha wept openly now, shoulders shaking. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. A wave of whispers rolled through the benches. Then, unexpectedly, a single clap sounded from the back. Another followed. Within seconds, applause filled the room. Not thunderous, but steady. Not for spectacle, for recognition. Caleb remained standing. For the first time since his arrest, he lifted his head fully, not in defiance, not in protest, but simply to look forward without lowering his gaze. Judge Whitman struck the gavel firmly. Order. But even her voice carried something different now, less certainty, more gravity. The evidence was undeniable. The pattern exposed. The scapegoat no longer alone. The storm outside finally broke, rain striking the courthouse windows in heavy bursts. Inside, the truth had already landed. The rain had stopped by the time the courtroom reconvened. Sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows, touching the polished wood benches with a pale glow that felt unfamiliar, almost hesitant. The air no longer buzzed with accusation. It carried something quieter. Uncertainty, perhaps even reflection. Caleb Johnson stood once more before Judge Eleanor Whitman. This time, Evan Miller stood at his side, not rushed, not breathless, but steady. The evidence presented the day before had been reviewed overnight by state investigators. Financial trails traced outward like cracked ice across a frozen lake. Names surfaced. Transactions aligned. What had been hidden in paperwork now stood in plain sight. Judge Whitman's voice carried a different weight now. In light of the newly admitted evidence and verified misconduct by senior management, all charges against Mr. Caleb Johnson are hereby dismissed. The words landed slowly. Dismissed, not reduced, not reconsidered. Dismissed. A collective breath moved through the courtroom. Caleb did not move at first. He had spent years preparing himself for doors closing. The sound of one opening felt almost unfamiliar. When he finally lifted his head, it was not in defiance nor in triumph, but in acknowledgement. His eyes were steady, meeting the gaze of those who once avoided it. Outside, cameras flashed. National media had picked up the story overnight. The image of a black man standing alone while a system attempted to bury him, and then the sudden reversal, had traveled far beyond Red Hollow. Commentators debated corporate corruption. Community leaders spoke about accountability. Clergy referenced forgiveness. Civil rights advocates spoke about quiet prejudice disguised as procedure. The courtroom applause from the previous day had been replayed on national broadcasts. People across the country began saying his name differently, not as a cautionary tale, but as a lesson. Reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. Microphones extended like cautious olive branches. Caleb stepped outside beside Evan, sunlight fully breaking through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The air felt sharper, clearer. "Mr. Johnson, do you intend to file a civil suit?" one reporter called. "Will you seek damages?" another asked. Caleb paused before answering. His voice was calm, measured. "I don't need revenge," he said. "I need fairness. I want the chance to work without carrying someone else's assumptions." The statement aired live. Across the state, viewers, black and white, listened. In a hospital room 2 towns away, Mary Johnson sat upright in bed, oxygen tube resting gently beneath her nose. Her skin remained fragile, but color had returned faintly to her cheeks. Beside her sat Mrs. Helen Porter, knitting quietly in a floral armchair by the window. The television mounted high on the wall showed Caleb standing beneath the courthouse steps. Mary's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not from fear. "He's standing tall," Helen whispered softly. Mary nodded, hand trembling slightly as she pressed it to her chest. He always did. Later that afternoon, Caleb walked through the hospital corridor toward his mother's room. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm linen. Nurses passed in soft-soled shoes. He hesitated at the doorway for only a second. Mary looked up when he entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb stepped forward, bending carefully to embrace her fragile frame. She felt lighter than he remembered. "You didn't come see me because you were ashamed," she said gently. He nodded once. "You never needed to be." It was the first time since returning to Red Hollow that Caleb allowed himself a full, unguarded smile. Not broad, not triumphant, just relieved. Days passed, and the mine remained under investigation. State officials appointed an interim oversight board. One of its members, Dr. Samuel Ortega, visited Red Hollow personally. Dr. Ortega was a tall, soft-spoken man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and rectangular glasses perched low on his nose. His background was in industrial safety reform. Years earlier, he had lost a cousin in a preventable mining collapse. Since then, he had devoted his career to transparency and worker protection. He requested a meeting with Caleb. "I've reviewed your documentation," Dr. Ortega said in a small conference room at the regional office. "You demonstrated vigilance under pressure." Caleb listened carefully. We are restructuring compliance protocols statewide. We need independent oversight, someone who understands the floor who cannot be pressured easily. Caleb understood the implication. You're offering me a position? He asked. Yes, independent safety and compliance inspector, reporting directly to the board. It was not glamorous, it was not corporate. But it was clean. Caleb accepted. Evan Miller watched the announcement from his modest office space downtown. The office consisted of one rented room above a hardware store, wooden floors slightly uneven, walls painted a hopeful shade of light gray. A brass plaque near the door now read, Miller and Associates, Labor Advocacy and Civil Defense. Evan sat behind a desk too large for the room, flipping through case files of underpaid workers, wrongful terminations, and safety complaints. He smiled faintly when the local paper headline appeared online. Exonerated minor appointed state compliance inspector. A knock sounded at his door. A young woman stepped inside hesitantly. Her name was Clara Whitfield, mid-20s, tall and thin with curly auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She wore a denim jacket over a faded blouse and carried a folder clutched tightly against her chest. Clara had grown up in a mining family and lost her father to a preventable equipment failure 3 years earlier. Since then, she had learned to speak carefully but firmly. I heard you help workers, she said quietly. Evan gestured toward the chair across from him. That's the plan. Red Hollow did not transform overnight. Rick Hanley kept his job but no longer walked quite as tall. Luke Harris resumed speaking to Caleb openly, though with humility rather than caution. Martha Green retired early, choosing to spend her days gardening behind her small home at the edge of town. She still carried guilt, but she also carried relief. The loading yard reopened under new management. Scale readings were monitored transparently. Checkpoints installed cameras along the northern tree line. People in town still whispered. But the tone had shifted. Conversations no longer ended with assumptions. They ended with questions. And that made all the difference. One evening, weeks later, Caleb stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The mine lights flickered below like distant stars. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. He did not feel vindicated. He felt balanced. He had not asked for a payout. He had not demanded headlines. He had asked only for space, to work honestly, to be measured by actions rather than history. And somehow, that request had traveled farther than he expected. The sun dipped slowly behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Red Hollow. But for the first time since his return, the darkness did not feel permanent. Light had found its way above the earth, and this time it stayed. Caleb Johnson's story is not only about a courtroom victory, it is about something much deeper. It is about how quickly we judge, how easily we label, and how often we allow someone's past to decide their future. In everyday life, most injustice does not look dramatic. It looks ordinary. It hides in assumptions, in silence, in small decisions that push someone aside because they seem different, because their record is imperfect, or because they are easier to blame. This story reminds us that integrity matters even when no one is watching. Caleb did not fight with anger. He fought with patience, preparation, and quiet truth. In our daily lives, we may never stand in a courtroom, but we all stand in moments where we must choose fairness over comfort, courage over silence, and dignity over prejudice. It also teaches us something about community. A town can ignore wrongdoing for years, but truth eventually demands light. When one person refuses to give up, when one person keeps records, keeps faith, and keeps hope, change becomes possible. Justice is not only about laws. It is about how we treat people at work, in school, in our neighborhoods, and even online. Before we criticize someone, let us ask ourselves whether we know the full story. Before we spread rumors, let us remember that words can wound as deeply as actions. And before we give up on someone, let us remember that redemption is real. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson stood out to you the most. Have you ever felt judged before being heard? Have you ever seen someone rise after being pushed down? If you believe in fairness, in second chances, and in treating every person with dignity, subscribe to this channel so we can continue telling stories that inspire courage and compassion. May God bless everyone watching right now. May He protect those who feel alone, strengthen those who are fighting silent battles, and guide us to be better to one another. If you believe that truth will always find its way into the light, comment Amen.